A black female prosecutor was driving home after a long day when flashing red and blue lights forced her to pull over. Without cause, a police officer drew his gun, pointing it at her in a display of raw intimidation and abuse of power. What he didn't know was that he had just targeted the wrong woman, one who knew the law better than he ever could. By the next day, the officer faced the full force of justice, his career in ruins as the truth came to light. Watch the full story unfold, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. The evening settled into a quiet hum as Valerie Carter drove home from work. As the assistant district attorney, her mind was still racing with the details of a high-profile corruption case she had been working on. The road was empty, the night calm until flashing red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. Her heart pounded. She hadn't violated any traffic laws, yet the siren blared behind her, demanding she pull over. She slowed to a stop, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. The officer exited his vehicle, his movements deliberate, controlled, exuding dominance. Mark Grayson had spent years using his badge to exercise power rather than serve justice. As he approached her window, his hand instinctively rested on the grip of his holstered gun. Without explanation, he demanded her license and registration, offering only a vague reason for the stop she fit a description. A sense of foreboding crept over her. She had seen this scenario play out too many times before, but never had she been the target. Keeping her hands visible, she calmly requested clarification, but Grayson's patience ran thin. His face darkened, and without hesitation, he drew his gun and ordered her to step out of the vehicle. A chill ran through her as she weighed her options. Any sudden movement could escalate the situation. Inside the patrol car, Officer Darren Collins watched with unease. He had partnered with Grayson for years and had witnessed his aggressive behavior. But tonight felt different. His gut twisted as he hesitated between speaking up and staying silent. Across town, Valerie's phone vibrated on the passenger seat. Her colleague, Rachel Monroe, had been expecting her call after work. When the call went unanswered, Rachel's unease grew. She reached for her own phone and dialed the precinct, demanding information on any reported stops matching Valerie's description. The response was vague, evasive. She didn't like it. Meanwhile, at the roadside stop, Valerie moved carefully, reaching for her ID. Grayson's grip tightened on his weapon, his finger hovering near the trigger. The situation teetered on the edge of disaster. Collins finally stepped out of the patrol car, his voice cutting through the tension. He attempted to de-escalate, but Grayson, unwilling to back down, barked at him to stay out of it. Miles away, Rachel's persistence paid off. A senior officer confirmed Valerie had been stopped but offered no further details. Alarm bells rang in Rachel's mind. She made another call, this time to the police chief himself. Within minutes, additional units were dispatched to the scene, their sirens piercing through the night. The sound of approaching vehicles changed the atmosphere. Grayson's eyes flickered with frustration. Valerie seized the moment to remind Collins that his body cam was recording, that his silence made him complicit. The reality of the situation dawned on him. With every passing second, his inaction became a choice. As the backup units arrived, the police chief stepped out, his presence shifting the power dynamic. His gaze locked onto Grayson, who still held his weapon at the ready. A tense standoff followed. Collins saw his chance and intervened, physically pulling Grayson back as the chief barked an order to stand down. Grayson hesitated, his arrogance wavering. He had lost control of the moment. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his gun. Valerie exhaled, the weight of the moment settling over her. The night had changed everything. Tomorrow would bring legal action, inquiries, and consequences. She would make sure of it. The system had protected men like Grayson for too long, but this time, justice would not be denied. Just as the tension began to settle, an anonymous figure within the precinct leaked additional records complaints against Grayson, internal reports buried under bureaucracy. The truth ran deeper than a single traffic stop. The corruption stretched into the very foundations of law enforcement, and Valerie had just found herself at the heart of it. Meanwhile, Collins, shaken by what had nearly transpired, made a choice. He stepped into the precinct and filed a formal report against his own partner. His testimony would be damning, and he knew it. But for the first time in his career, he decided to stand on the right side of justice. Rachel, unwilling to let the situation rest, reached out to the media. By morning, headlines would expose not only Grayson's abuse of power but the systemic failures that had enabled him for years. The story had grown beyond Valerie's personal ordeal; it had become a movement. Grayson, realizing the walls were closing in, reached out to an old ally, someone willing to cover his tracks. But it was too late. The chain of events had already been set in motion. The police chief, unwilling to risk further scrutiny, placed him on immediate suspension pending investigation. But Valerie knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was still ahead, and she was ready. Valerie Carter sat in her office, the events of the previous night replaying in her mind. The anger had settled into something colder, more precise. She had spent her career prosecuting those who abused power, and now she found herself the victim of that very corruption. The footage had been submitted to the necessary authorities, but she knew how the system worked. Things could be buried, reports rewritten. She wasn't about to let that happen. Meanwhile, Officer Mark Grayson sat in his apartment, scrolling through the news. His face was everywhere, the footage damning. His superiors had called, demanding an explanation. He had tried to justify his actions, but no one was buying it. He wasn't just facing suspension, he was facing charges. The walls were closing in, and he knew he had to act fast if he wanted to regain control. Inside the precinct, Officer Darren Collins wrestled with his conscience. He had filed his report, confirming everything that had transpired, but the weight of it sat heavy on him. He had seen officers get away with worse. The backlash against Grayson was unprecedented, and that meant the department was scrambling. He wondered if they would try to turn this around, to make Valerie the aggressor. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee. He had made his choice, but the fight was far from over. At City Hall, the mayor and the police chief were locked in a tense discussion. The department was under scrutiny, public trust was crumbling, and the media was relentless. There were calls for an independent investigation, something that could tear apart the very structure they had worked to protect. Damage control was necessary, but they needed a scapegoat. The question was, would it be Grayson, or would they find a way to redirect the blame? Rachel Monroe was already 10 steps ahead. She had been Valerie's friend and colleague for years, and she wasn't about to let this become just another forgotten case. She reached out to journalists, ensuring that the story didn't fade. She dug into Grayson's history, uncovering a pattern of complaints, reports that had been conveniently dismissed. She compiled everything, preparing for the inevitable legal battle ahead. Grayson made a desperate move. He reached out to an old contact, someone with enough influence to manipulate the system. He needed dirt on Valerie, anything that could discredit her. He was willing to pay for it. He knew that if he could shift the narrative, he might just survive this. Meanwhile, Valerie received an anonymous tip, a warning. Someone inside the department was trying to frame her, fabricating evidence that could turn the case against her. She wasn't surprised, but she was furious. She reached out to her own sources, gathering every piece of leverage she had. If they wanted a fight, she was more than ready. The city's tension grew. Protests erupted outside the precinct, citizens demanding justice. The media followed every development, pressuring officials for answers. The police union hesitated, unsure of whether to defend Grayson or distance themselves. The power struggle within the department intensified, with some officers backing Collins while others remained loyal to Grayson. Then, the unexpected happened. A second video surfaced, footage from inside the precinct. It captured a conversation between high-ranking officers discussing how to handle the situation. They weren't interested in justice. They were interested in survival. And now, the entire world could see it. As the footage spread, the narrative shifted once more. This wasn't just about one corrupt officer. This was about an entire system built to protect its own. Valerie watched as the city responded, the demands for accountability growing louder. She had set out to ensure Grayson faced consequences, but now, she realized this was bigger than him. Collins made his final decision. He stepped forward, not just with his report, but with evidence of internal corruption. He risked everything, knowing that once he did this, there was no turning back. His testimony would solidify the case against Grayson, but it would also expose those who had enabled him. Grayson, now completely isolated, tried to run. He packed his bags, prepared to disappear before the legal hammer came down. But it was too late. The department, eager to save itself, turned him in. Officers arrived at his apartment, arresting him before he could make his escape. Valerie stood outside the courthouse, watching as Grayson was led inside. Justice was finally being served, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The system was still broken, and there were still people willing to manipulate it. But this was a step forward, a battle won in a war that was far from finished. Rachel stood beside her, nodding in quiet approval. The message was clear: abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. As the media continued to cover the case, Valerie made a silent vow: she would keep pushing until every corrupt officer, every enabler, and every manipulator was held accountable. Stevens, a former high-ranking officer, watched the news unfold from his secluded hideout. He had worked alongside Grayson before, covered for him, and now feared that he would be next. He made a call, seeking out allies who might still be able to protect him, but the silence on the other end confirmed his suspicions. No one wanted to be associated with him anymore. Rachel discovered that the department was not only trying to discredit Valerie, but had also contacted a judge in an attempt to suppress some of the evidence against Grayson. She quickly arranged a meeting with Valerie and a trusted federal investigator, ensuring that any attempt to manipulate the courts would be exposed before it could take effect. A high-ranking officer within the precinct, known for keeping his hands clean, was revealed to have signed off on multiple falsified reports connected to Grayson's past misconduct. Valerie's legal team wasted no time drafting subpoenas, forcing internal leaders to answer for their complicity in years of corruption. A group of rogue officers, still loyal to Grayson, attempted to intimidate Collins into recanting his testimony. They left anonymous threats, followed him home, and tried to paint him as a traitor within the department. But instead of breaking, Collins went on record with the threats, further fueling public outrage and strengthening the case against the corrupt faction. As the legal proceedings intensified, Valerie received an unexpected visit from an officer who had spent decades in the force but had remained silent. He slid a thick envelope across the table, files detailing backdoor deals, evidence tampering, and case manipulations that spanned more than a decade. With this, Valerie knew she wasn't just dealing with the corruption of one precinct. This was a system-wide problem, and now she had the proof she needed to bring it all crashing down. Valerie Carter sat in a dimly lit conference room, surrounded by stacks of case files and her legal team. The tension in the air was suffocating. The case against Officer Mark Grayson had ignited a firestorm, and now, more names were surfacing: higher-ups who had covered for him, officers who had looked the other way. What had started as a single incident was unraveling into a systemic scandal that threatened to topple an entire institution. Valerie knew the fight was only beginning. Mark Grayson was escorted into a holding cell, his wrists bound in handcuffs that felt heavier than they should have. His fall from grace had been swift, and now, he was nothing more than a disgraced officer awaiting trial. His attorney had assured him there was still a way out, that the department wouldn't let him take the full blame. But as he sat alone, he realized that no one was coming to save him. The phone calls had stopped. The alliances had crumbled. He had become expendable. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, Officer Darren Collins watched the internal chaos unfold. The department was splitting in two: those who wanted to clean house and those who wanted to bury the truth. Collins had made his decision. He had put everything on the line when he testified against Grayson. Now, he was facing silent stares, cold shoulders, and whispers behind his back. The same officers he once called brothers now treated him like a traitor. He knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to make him regret it. Rachel Monroe, Valerie's closest ally, sat in front of a television screen in the newsroom, reviewing the latest evidence that had just surfaced. A leaked recording from inside the precinct revealed a private conversation between high-ranking officials discussing how to control the narrative. They had known about Grayson's pattern of abuse for years, but had done nothing to stop him. Now their secrets were coming to light, and the public outrage was spreading like wildfire. Rachel sent the file to Valerie's legal team, knowing this would shift the balance in their favor. At City Hall, the mayor and the police chief were under siege. The press conference had started amicably, with carefully crafted statements aimed at damage control, but the reporters weren't buying it. The questions became more aggressive, demanding accountability. Who else was complicit? How far did the corruption reach? The chief's carefully composed expression began to crack. He had spent years protecting officers like Grayson, but now, the weight of it was crushing him. He glanced at the mayor, but there was no saving face. The truth was out, and they were running out of time. Grayson's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, hoping to reduce his sentence in exchange for cooperation. But Valerie wasn't interested in half measures. She wanted full disclosure: names, dates, every detail of the department's internal rot. Grayson hesitated. He knew that if he talked, he would be making enemies out of people who were far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But as he looked around his cell, reality set in. He was already alone. He had nothing left to lose. Collins received an anonymous message, a single warning: stay out of it. He knew what it meant. The remaining officers who still supported Grayson were planning something, and he was in their way. He tightened his grip on his coffee cup, contemplating his next move. He had come too far to back down now. If they wanted him silenced, they would have to do more than send a message. That night, Valerie received a tip from an informant inside the precinct. A hidden file contained records of falsified reports, buried complaints, and tampered evidence, all tied to Grayson and his enablers. The document was damning. She arranged an emergency meeting with her team, knowing this was the leverage they needed. The prosecution's case was about to become ironclad. Meanwhile, inside the precinct's underground parking lot, Collins felt a presence behind him. He turned, but it was too late. A masked figure lunged, striking him across the head. He staggered, pain blurring his vision. His instincts kicked in, and he fought back, landing a blow against his attacker. A scuffle ensued, but the sound of approaching footsteps sent the assailant fleeing. Collins fell to his knees, blood trickling down his temple. He knew exactly what had just happened. They weren't sending messages anymore. They were making their move. Valerie received a call in the middle of the night. Collins was in the hospital, recovering from a concussion. The message was clear: this wasn't just a legal battle anymore. The corruption ran deep, and those protecting it were willing to use violence to keep their secrets buried. But Valerie refused to be intimidated. If anything, this only fueled her resolve. The next morning, the city woke to another bombshell. Rachel's newsroom had released the secret precinct files, exposing decades of cover-ups. The department was in freefall. The police chief was forced to resign. The mayor called for an independent oversight committee. Valerie, standing in front of a swarm of reporters, declared that this was only the beginning. Inside his cell, Grayson watched the news unfold. He had thought he was untouchable. Now, he was nothing more than a cautionary tale. He closed his eyes, realizing that his time was up. He had lost everything, and there was no way out. Collins, still recovering, sat upright in his hospital bed as Valerie visited him. She assured him that he wasn't alone, that justice was finally prevailing. He nodded, knowing she was right. He had made the right choice, and now there was no turning back. As the legal proceedings continued, Valerie prepared for the next phase. The case had started with one officer abusing his power, but now it had become a fight for systemic change. She wasn't just going after Grayson, she was going after everyone who had protected him. The battle was far from over, but she was ready. The system had tried to break her, but she had only grown stronger. And now, she was the one holding the power. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Valerie Carter sat at the prosecution's table, her fingers lightly tapping against the surface. The case had reached its turning point. Every move she made from this moment forward would determine whether justice prevailed or if the system would protect its own once again. Grayson sat in the defendant's chair, his hands clenched into fists. His lawyer had spent days working on a strategy, but there were cracks forming. The evidence against him was overwhelming, the witnesses damning. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of hope. But hope was in short supply. Inside the precinct, Collins walked through the halls, feeling the shift in atmosphere. Officers who had once given him friendly nods now averted their gazes. He had crossed a line in their eyes, choosing integrity over blind loyalty. His locker had been vandalized, his car tires slashed. The warning was clear: he wasn't welcome anymore. But Collins wasn't backing down. Rachel Monroe sifted through new evidence at her desk, her eyes scanning over financial records that painted an even darker picture. It wasn't just Grayson, it was a network. Payments, bribes, and cover-ups ran deeper than they had anticipated. She forwarded the files to Valerie with a single message: "This goes higher than we thought. Be careful." The police chief sat in his office, listening to a report from Internal Affairs. Pressure from city officials and the public had reached an all-time high. There was no salvaging the department's reputation without drastic action. He had fought to keep the focus on Grayson, but now, the walls were closing in on him too. He had played his part in covering up corruption, and it was only a matter of time before someone pointed a finger in his direction. That night, Collins received another anonymous threat. A printed note slipped under his door. "Last warning. Walk away." He crumpled it in his fist, refusing to be intimidated. He had seen firsthand what men like Grayson were capable of. He wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions. Valerie met with Rachel in a secured location, away from prying eyes. They laid out the full scope of the case before them. If they went forward with what they had, they wouldn't just be taking down Grayson, they'd be dismantling an entire infrastructure of corruption. It was risky. It was dangerous. But neither of them hesitated. The next day, the trial resumed. Valerie took the floor, presenting the newly uncovered evidence. The courtroom fell silent as she detailed the web of lies, coercion, and abuse that had been hidden for years. Grayson's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed it. The weight of the truth was undeniable. Across the city, the protests outside the precinct grew louder. The public was no longer satisfied with one man taking the fall. They wanted accountability at every level. Officers inside the station watched from the windows, some nervous, others furious. The divide was growing, and soon it would reach a breaking point. Grayson finally snapped. In a desperate move, he lashed out in court, shouting that he wasn't the only guilty one. He named names, throwing former allies under the bus in a last-ditch attempt to save himself. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the full extent of the corruption was laid bare. The police chief received a call moments later. The city was moving forward with an independent oversight committee. His career was effectively over. He stared at his desk, realizing that his decades of maneuvering had led to nothing but disgrace. He had thought he could control the system, but now it was consuming him. Valerie stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of victory tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. She had struck a blow against corruption, but there were still battles to be fought. The system had shown its cracks, and now it was up to her to keep pushing until it crumbled entirely. Collins walked into the precinct for what he knew would be the last time. He turned in his badge, knowing that he had done the right thing. His career in law enforcement was over, but his conscience was clear. As he stepped outside, he didn't look back. He was moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, he felt free. Grayson sat in his cell, his mind racing. The allies he had counted on had vanished. The department had sacrificed him to save themselves. He had spent his life believing he was untouchable, but now, he realized the truth: everyone was expendable. And now, he was nothing. Valerie Carter sat in the courtroom, her fingers wrapped around the edges of the file she had spent the last 3 days compiling. The weight of the evidence pressed against her like a loaded gun. The case had gone beyond Grayson. It was bigger, more insidious than she had initially imagined. Every step forward uncovered another layer of deceit, another cover-up, another betrayal. Grayson sat across from her, shackled but still exuding the arrogance of a man who believed he had an ace up his sleeve. His plea deal had fallen apart, his allies had abandoned him, but he still had one last play. He knew the system, knew how to manipulate it. He just needed to find the right pressure point. Inside the precinct, Officer Darren Collins faced his own storm. He had testified against Grayson, and the backlash had been swift. Anonymous notes were left in his locker, his tires were slashed, and every conversation in the precinct seemed to stop the moment he walked into the room. He knew he had a target on his back, but he refused to back down. He had chosen a side, and there was no turning back now. Rachel Monroe scrolled through her messages, eyes scanning the latest leaks coming from inside the police department. Whistleblowers were coming forward, each testimony painting an even darker picture of the corruption that had festered for years. She knew that if she moved too fast, the story could collapse under scrutiny. If she moved too slow, the evidence could disappear. Timing was everything. At City Hall, the mayor and police chief locked themselves in a private meeting. The department's reputation was disintegrating. The public outrage was overwhelming. Protests had erupted outside the courthouse, demanding not just Grayson's conviction but a complete overhaul of law enforcement practices. The mayor wanted to contain the damage, to find a way to spin the situation before it completely unraveled. The police chief, however, knew it was too late. The system they had protected for so long was collapsing under its own weight. That night, Valerie received a tip, an anonymous message warning her that the case was about to take a dangerous turn. Someone was planning to intervene, to make sure the trial never reached its conclusion. She didn't know who it was, but she knew one thing: they were desperate. Collins arrived home to find his front door ajar. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he stepped inside. The place was ransacked. Files he had taken from the precinct, notes he had made gone. A message was scrawled across his living room wall in red paint: "Walk away while you still can." Rachel's newsroom received an unmarked package. Inside, a USB drive held footage, secret meetings, officers exchanging money, fabricated reports being signed off. It was damning. It was everything they needed to take this case beyond Grayson. But it also meant that whoever sent it was risking their life. She needed to act fast before the source disappeared. Grayson, now fully aware that he was running out of options, made his move. He reached out to a former ally, someone high enough in the chain of command to have influence. If he could strike a deal, if he could shift the blame just enough, he might still have a way out. But the conversation didn't go as planned. The man on the other end of the call made it clear Grayson was on his own. Valerie took the stand the next morning, presenting the new evidence. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The defense scrambled to object, but the judge allowed it. The footage was played, and silence fell over the room. The jury watched as years of corruption unfolded before their eyes. There was no coming back from this. Collins, still reeling from the break-in, doubled down. He contacted Internal Affairs, demanding protection. If they wanted to silence him, they were going to have to do it in front of the entire world. He wasn't running. Rachel prepared her final report, knowing it would be the most dangerous story she had ever published. She had the names, the documents, the proof. The only question was whether those in power would let the truth come to light, or if they would find a way to bury it once again. Grayson's last attempt to manipulate the system failed. The verdict was swift guilty on all counts. The room erupted, protesters cheering outside the courthouse. But Valerie didn't celebrate. She knew the fight wasn't over. This was just one battle in a war that had been waged for decades. As she stepped outside into the blinding light of the cameras and microphones, she made a silent vow. The system had tried to break her. It had failed. And now, she was going to make sure it never happened again. Valerie Carter stood before a row of cameras, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on her shoulders. The conviction of Mark Grayson had sent shockwaves through the city, but the fight was far from over. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that his actions were not isolated, they were part of a system designed to protect those in power. As she answered the barrage of questions from the press, she knew that what came next would be even more dangerous. Inside the precinct, Officer Darren Collins was on high alert. The threats against him had escalated. His locker had been broken into, his tires slashed for a second time. He had already moved his family out of their home, knowing that those who wanted to silence him would stop at nothing. He kept a watchful eye on his colleagues, noting who avoided eye contact and who whispered when he walked by. The department was a battlefield, and he was stuck in the middle of it. Rachel Monroe worked late into the night, piecing together the latest leaks from her anonymous sources. The documents she had received outlined a network of officers who had operated above the law for years. Bribery, case manipulation, and buried complaints were all laid bare in front of her. With one final keystroke, she sent the report to her editor. The world needed to see this, and there was no turning back now. Meanwhile, in a private office at City Hall, the mayor and the police commissioner debated their next move. The calls for reform had grown louder, and resignations were being demanded. They had tried to manage the fallout, but the story had spiraled beyond their control. The conversation turned to damage control who could be sacrificed to appease the public without unraveling the entire department. Names were thrown around, but one thing was clear: Valerie Carter had made herself a target. Grayson sat in his prison cell, his mind racing. He had thought he would be protected, that those in power would ensure he walked free. But they had abandoned him the moment the public turned against him. His last play had failed, and now he was left to rot. He had one final option: if he couldn't save himself, he could take others down with him. He requested a meeting with his attorney, ready to cut a deal. Late that night, Collins received a message from an unknown number. "We're watching. Back off." He read it twice before deleting it. Fear gnawed at the edges of his resolve, but he refused to let it take hold. He had come too far. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. Valerie's legal team worked tirelessly to prepare for the next wave of indictments. The list of corrupt officials was growing, and with each name added, the danger increased. Her team urged caution, but she refused to slow down. She knew what was at stake. She had to keep pushing forward. Rachel's article was published at dawn. The headline screamed of conspiracy and corruption, implicating multiple high-ranking officials. The response was immediate. Protests erupted in front of the courthouse, the calls for accountability reaching a fever pitch. The police union released a statement dismissing the accusations, but the cracks in their facade were showing. The city was at a tipping point. The police commissioner held an emergency press conference, attempting to control the narrative. He announced internal investigations and suspensions, trying to convince the public that change was coming. But behind closed doors, he was issuing orders to make the problem go away by any means necessary. That night, Valerie returned to her apartment, exhaustion settling in. As she locked the door, her phone buzzed. A voicemail from an unknown number played through the speaker. "Walk away while you still can." Her grip on the phone tightened. She had expected this. It only confirmed what she already knew: she was getting too close. Across town, a figure moved in the shadows outside Rachel's building. She had taken precautions, but she knew she was being followed. Her instincts screamed at her to stay inside, to lay low, but she had never been one to back down. She reached for her phone, ready to document anything suspicious. If they wanted her silenced, they would have to do it in the open. Grayson's deal was accepted. He provided names, dates, and evidence in exchange for reduced sentencing. His testimony would bring down some of the highest-ranking officials in the department. The wheels were now in motion. The system was starting to turn on itself. Collins made his final decision. He walked into internal affairs, documents in hand. He was done hiding. If the department wanted to get rid of him, they would have to do it publicly. His report was filed, and with it, another nail was driven into the coffin of a corrupt system. The city braced itself for what came next. The war had just begun. Valerie Carter sat at the prosecution's table, the weight of the trial pressing against her shoulders. The courtroom was silent, save for the murmurs of anticipation. The case had unraveled into something far larger than she had anticipated. What had begun as an effort to convict Officer Mark Grayson had turned into a systemic reckoning. Today, the jury would deliver their final verdict, but Valerie knew this fight wouldn't end with one conviction. Grayson sat rigid, his eyes darting between the judge and his lawyer. His plea deal had bought him time, but at the cost of betraying those who had protected him for years. He had given up names, files, and testimonies that exposed a deep-rooted corruption network. The very people who had shielded him now saw him as the enemy. He had thought this deal would save him, but instead, it had made him the most vulnerable man in the room. Across the city, the police department was in chaos. Officers who had been implicated in the scandal were being pulled from duty. Internal Affairs was conducting an unprecedented sweep, reviewing every case that had passed through certain hands. Some officers resigned before they could be investigated, while others scrambled to save themselves, offering whatever information they could. The walls of protection were crumbling, and those who had stood behind them were being exposed one by one. Rachel Monroe sat at her desk, reviewing the latest developments. Her newsroom had been working around the clock, ensuring that no detail was buried, no testimony ignored. The response had been explosive. Protests filled the streets, demanding lasting reforms. The media had shifted the conversation beyond just Grayson's trial now. The focus was on systemic change. But Rachel knew that public outrage could only do so much. The real question was whether those in power would allow the system to be rebuilt, or if they would find a way to patch the cracks and continue as usual. Inside City Hall, the mayor and the police commissioner met behind closed doors. The pressure was unbearable. The corruption had reached too high, the scandal too large to contain. They had spent weeks trying to control the fallout, but now, their own seats of power were under scrutiny. The calls for resignations were growing louder. If they didn't act quickly, they wouldn't be making decisions. They would be forced out. Darren Collins sat in the hospital bed, still recovering from the attack that had nearly silenced him. He had known the risk when he decided to testify, but knowing it didn't make it easier. He had spent years believing in the badge, believing that justice could exist within the system. Now, he wasn't sure anymore. His testimony had helped push the trial forward, but the scars left behind were more than just physical. He had lost everything: his job, his friendships, his sense of certainty. And yet, even in his weakest moments, he knew he had done the right thing. The verdict was delivered. Guilty. The courtroom erupted, gasps mixing with the murmurs of approval. Valerie sat still, exhaling slowly. Justice had been served, but the victory was bittersweet. Grayson would serve his time, but he was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Outside, the protests intensified. People weren't satisfied with one conviction; they wanted to see real change. The pressure was mounting on city officials. New policies were being proposed, oversight committees formed. But Valerie knew how fragile progress could be. The system didn't crumble easily. It fought back, adapted, found new ways to protect itself. She had seen it before, and she knew she would see it again. Rachel received a new tip: an anonymous source claiming to have evidence of higher-level involvement. A secret ledger, detailing payments and backdoor deals, hidden away in the depths of city records. If it was real, it would expose the highest-ranking officials in the department. The fight wasn't over. It was escalating. Collins made his decision. He had been approached by federal investigators, offering him protection in exchange for continued cooperation. He had nothing left to lose. He agreed. If his testimony could dismantle the rest of the network, then that was what he would do. Valerie stepped out of the courthouse, cameras flashing around her. Reporters shouted questions, but she didn't stop. She had already decided what came next. She wasn't just going to prosecute corruption; she was going to dismantle it. The system had tried to break her, to intimidate her, to silence her. It had failed. As the city braced for what came next, one thing was clear: the war was far from over.